Well, welcome everybody. My name is Scott Arnold, and on behalf of the Institute for Climate Risk and Response, welcome to our seminar. Acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which the seminar is occurring and your homes where you've travelled from. Today we have a presentation from Tanya. Many of you will know Tanya. I'm not going to give an introduction. Tanya joined us 2 months ago now.
Yeah, about
almost 3 months ago. It's fantastic because one of the things that's so important to the Institute is our ability to draw together people from different backgrounds, different disciplines, and to hopefully harness those different skills, different experiences, different methodologies towards some common, very important problems. This is being recorded. If you're uncomfortable with that, don't make any noise, but I do have to disclose that we are recording it. It will be available to you at some point in the future. We're not live, so there's nobody online watching it. Would you like to defer questions until the end? Is that the best way to?
I don't really mind, to be honest.
Okay, so if something vital comes up, or if it's something clarification for, please raise your hand and we can deal with that then. But we will have time at the end for questions for people. Notice a couple of you turning off your mobile phones. Thank you very much for that. But an introduction. Welcome, Tanya.
Thank you. Okay. You just remind me I should turn my own mobile phone off. Okay, good. All right. Okay. Well. Thank you for giving me this opportunity, and great to see a diversity of people here from different disciplines, which is what I'm really interested in exploring today and in general in my research. So just wanted to know, is this going to work? It was working a moment ago. Okay, there we go. No, that's not working either.
I have to click on the screen. It might be.
See. Okay. All right. So yes, just to start off, and this is important context because I know that there are professors of accounting sitting in the room. I'm not a trained accountant, and they know that because I did my PhD in accounting here. I'm also not a trained climate scientist, and I don't profess to be a climate scientist in any form whatsoever. And I know that there are climate scientists here in this room. So I'm previously an environmental consultant, and there are other careers that happened before that. So I really come from quite a diverse background. But I have a research agenda which has been pretty consistent since I started my accounting PhD, and that is to really try and understand how information can be translated from the climate sciences, from engineering, from economics, to provide information that is not only useful for business decision-making purposes, but also impactful in the sense that those decisions have a positive environmental outcome. So now, I'm going to keep things challenging. In terms of what I'm presenting today, it's informed by well over 100 interviews that I've conducted over the last 5 years. So I'm a qualitative accounting researcher, and these interviews have been conducted with account preparers, account standard setters, engineers, climate scientists, lawyers, regulators, so a whole host of people to try and understand what the challenges are in this process of translation. In addition, I have a number of ongoing collaborations with some climate scientists, notably Andy Pittman, as well as Michael Gross, Michael Jacob, so Christian Jacob, and others, and then also in accounting, predominantly to date with my former supervisor, Wai-Fong Chua, and a lot of these the papers that we're either working on, so there are some papers that are working papers at the moment, some that have been published, they all in some way deal with this challenge that I'm trying to understand, which is this process of translation. So in terms, and then I thought a little bit about you guys. So just again, I know that there are climate scientists in the room. I think there's people from risk and actuarial, banking and finance. There were people who are going to come from banking and finance. So some of the information that I'm going to talk about will be really mundane for some of you, but novel for others of you. And so just bear with me when there are slides where you think, okay, this is taking me straight back to year one of my degree, my undergraduate degree. Okay. All right. So I know the accountants will know who this person is. So could someone who isn't an accounting, from accounting, would you know who this person is? No. Okay, so I just wanted to, yeah, you're not from accounting, but you do actually know who this person is. So tell us, who is it?
It's Mr. Pacioli.
Mr. Pacioli, that's right. Okay, and the reason I put his picture up there is I thought it's just worth taking a step back for a moment and just reflecting on the journey of accounting over the last 2,000 years. And it's a journey that has been considerable. So, you know, from cost accounting in some form, 2000 BC, to, you know, in 1494, Luca Pacioli documented the process of double entry bookkeeping. So we have had systems, accounting procedures and systems in place in accounting for centuries. For how we account for monetary flows within an organisation. And I think if you spoke to most people within accounting, they would say, well, we haven't quite solved the problem yet. But there's still lots of questions because otherwise there wouldn't be accounting academics. So the question then comes, well, if we haven't yet solved accounting for monetary flows, how do we think we can solve accounting for a physical system as complex as the climate within the space of 7 years, which is pretty much what we've tried to do. From the start of the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, which I'm assuming most people in the room, is there anyone who hasn't heard of them? Okay, great. Excellent. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or TCFD, was a task force that was convened by the G20's finance ministers out of they also had a financial stability board, and the remit of the financial stability board was to identify anything on the horizon that might destabilize the global economy. And one of the things that they identified was climate change. So from that, they established the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures. And the TCFD in 2017, they published a series of recommendations for disclosures that companies should make to the public publicly to demonstrate their exposure to different types of climate risks and opportunities. And included within that are physical risks and opportunities, so the risks and opportunities arising from a changing climate, to their assets and their operations and investments and so on, as well as transition risks, so the risks arising from the global transition to a zero carbon economy. Now, what I'm going to deal with mostly today is physical risk. So I won't go so much into transition risk. But since 2017, there's just been this monumental effort in the standard setting space. And standard setting, I know, is not a terribly sexy sort of domain from the outside, but it's been really interesting to observe because it's basically the International Accounting Standards, or the International Financial Reporting Standards Foundation, have formed an entirely new standard setting body called the International Sustainability Standards Board to enable, I suppose, to formalise the recommendations that were made here in a way that enables, where there are regulatory mandates that are made, like in Australia, these will be forthcoming, to enable or to standardise the reports that companies publish so that they are hopefully consistent and comparable in nature. So yeah, so we're now in a space where we have mandatory disclosures commencing, we're told in July 2024, but I understand that it might be a little bit later, possibly next year.
The proposal is still.
Yeah, it's still there.
24. Yep.
Okay, I just heard something the other day, but yeah, okay.
The proposal is still 24.
Yeah, yeah. Okay. All right, so yeah, so you can see there's obviously, you know, everyone uses the term we're learning as we're doing, and that's definitely what's happening. So everything that I present today is very much in the context of acknowledging that this is heroic. And it's absolutely the right thing to do, and it needed to happen. But it's also worth taking a step back and reflecting on, okay, we've tried to do it really super quickly. Have we done it really with the climate in mind? And my answer to that would be, well, there are some problems. Okay, so in terms of today's discussion, what I'd like to cover off is just contrasting the language, norms and conceptual underpinnings of accounting with the objectives and the tools that are available in the climate sciences, and particularly global climate models and their projections, and the tensions that then emerge when we're trying to bring these two together, and then looking at ways forward. And is that a way forward for accountants and standard setters, or is it for climate scientists, or, you know, what is it, something in between? Okay, so in terms of accounting, so this is the slide that's going to be boring for the accountants. So there's something in accounting called the conceptual framework, which provides the sort of foundations from which companies prepare their public reports. And the key concepts here have been brought into what will now become climate disclosures. So the objective of these reports, and this is pretty important to understand, is to provide financial information about the reporting entity that is useful to existing and potential investors, lenders, and other creditors in making their decisions. So the first thing I just want to point out here is this concept of an entity. Okay, so it's the idea that you have a bounded economic entity that is separate from other entities, which, if you think about climate context, imagine, you know, you're isolating something that's in some ways quite small, and that could be highly distributed and fragmented in terms of its geographical footprint. And it has a financial boundary, not a physical boundary. And this other concept of being useful or decision useful is also really, really important. So the information that's provided in any type of reporting, and that includes climate reporting, should be decision useful, which means you want the information to be founded on good quality insights. Yeah. Not to be founded on information that is spurious in nature, because that can then lead to maladaptation. It can lead to capital being incorrectly allocated, and that can have all sorts of implications over the short, medium, and long term. And so, yeah, so those two concepts are really important. Then, in terms of determining what information is decision useful, the conceptual framework provides qualitative characteristics of useful information. And the two here are that decision useful information is relevant, which means that it's capable of making a difference when, say, a lender or investor, when they're looking at a report, is making a decision about that company. Should I invest in that company or not? And really sort of integrated with that idea of relevant is this idea of financial materiality, because information is relevant if it is material, in the sense that if the information were excluded from a report, it would change the decision-making of an investor or lender or one of the stakeholders. Now, the other qualitative characteristic is faithful representation, which is the idea that the information presented should, the substance of the information presented should faithfully represent the phenomena that it purports to represent. Okay, and ideally that would mean that the information is complete, that it's, what were the other ones? Free from error, and there was a third one as well. I can't remember. Anyway, there are some, you can see there are some ideas beginning to come through that are important from a, if you start thinking about the nature of climate information. So for those of you in the room who are from the climate science side. Okay. And then we also have the enhancing characteristics of useful information. And these are also in the conceptual framework. And again, so there's this idea, and this is particularly important from a standard setting perspective of comparability. You want information to be comparable. So you can compare, say, the climate scenarios reported from one entity in the marketplace against those of another entity, say from the same industry. Yeah. And then also that they should be verifiable. Okay. So I'm going to look at all of these points as we go along. Now, if we contrast this with the objectives of the climate sciences. So so the climate sciences existed long before 1980. But in 1980, the World Climate Research Programme was established, and to determine the predictability of climate and the effect of human activities on the climate. Okay, so straight away, I just want to contrast. We're not talking entity level, we're talking global scale. Okay, and then the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change was formed in 1988, and similar idea there. Wanting to examine the current state of knowledge on climate change and its potential environmental and socioeconomic impacts. So from the World Climate Research Programme, there are a number of programs underneath it that have produced multiple, and the climate scientists in the room will be able to speak to this a lot better than I can, petabytes of quantitative data, and this data is freely available. Okay, and this is really important because what has happened now that we have these climate disclosures emerging is that because we have this tension between information that is focused on providing insights at the global scale, and I know that climate models are not just global scale models, they're also regional models, but the impetus, the initial motivation was one of understanding the global scale. But we have businesses that are required to report information at the entity level. The problem is we don't have the information. We don't have information from the climate sciences at the entity level. So we've had this literally arms race, that's how it's been described in the literature, of climate service providers developing black box proprietary models that claim that their information has veracity and that they can provide information at business relevant scales. So for example, you'll see pictures on their websites that say, that indicate that a cyclone is likely to hit this particular location in 30 years' time, which you ask back there, might contradict that. Yeah. So, so there's a real problem here. Because if we go back to those accounting principles of, say, faithful representation, you know, that information should be complete, or also that it's relevant, that it can help with decision making. Well, are you helping with decision making if you're receiving information that guides you in a direction that means that you allocate capital incorrectly, that you do not make the right decisions? And the other thing is that there's this, I believe, this perception because of this massive amounts of data, that there's this perception that because there's this enormous quantitative precision, that there must therefore also be accuracy in that data and the ways in which it is used. So, And if you think about it from a business perspective, they've never dealt with this type of information before. So of course they're going to want to utilize those services. It's challenging not to. Okay, so I'm just going to talk through some of the challenges that we've sort of been trying to flesh out. So we've got a paper that's currently in review. And these are some of the challenges when we think about information being decision useful at business relevant scales, or also being addressing the issue of financial materiality. And the reason for that is because if you think about what affects a business, what is financially material to a business, it's not if the global mean temperature rises by an additional 0.5 degrees. It's whether or not there will be, say, 3 East Coast lows in succession, meaning that by the time the third one gets there, the ground is completely saturated and there's just going to be massive flooding. What matters is, if a cyclone hits Brisbane, and Brisbane is not cyclone rated in terms of the infrastructure. So it's these high impact extreme events. They're the ones that are financially material for business. So, and the problem is, so this is a representation of a global climate model, and it shows how climate models pixelate the Earth and also the oceans into, my understanding is currently around about 100 by 100 kilometre scales. So if you think about how many businesses can exist within 100 by 100 kilometres, and they're all pretty much, they're lumped into that space of 100 by 100 kilometres. Now, to represent this mathematically on the computing power that's needed is extraordinary. So I'm told that it can take months to run a single simulation on a national supercomputer, and that the outputs generated are in the petabytes. So for example, making this spatial scale smaller, more business relevant, is very, very costly from a computing perspective, if you're going to do it at the global scale. Yeah. So spatial scale is an issue. We don't have global climate models that represent climate effects at business relevant spatial scales. There are, as I mentioned earlier, regional climate models, but these have other issues associated with them because they're honing in on smaller areas. Again, computing power is an issue, but it means then that they can't do other things. They perhaps can't go as far into the future. And there are other issues as well, which I'm not going to go into because I'm not the expert in that space. There's also the matter of temporal scale. So because the things that impact at the local scale are these extreme events. Extreme events are affected also by dynamical processes such as the El Nino, La Nina cycle, yeah. And these create noise in these climate simulations, which it takes several decades to sort of filter out so that you can see the climate signal. So it's not possible to get information around what will happen, say, in the next 5 or 10 years from a climate model. Again, there are other types of models. There are prediction systems, but they don't actually tell you about how the climate is changing. They tell you about what's happening with natural variability. Okay, so and then there are issues with the models themselves. So a lot of the models might share the same lines of code, which means that they're not independent from one another. They are also based on scenarios of the future, so socioeconomic scenarios of the way in which the future world might evolve. And we don't know what that's going to be. Yeah. So we can't actually say, how politics might unfold, how Ukraine might unfold, etc. And then you can choose models to create an ensemble that might indeed tell you that rainfall in a particular area is going to increase. But if you had a more, and might be to your advantage to tell you that from a business perspective, or it might be to your advantage to say that actually rainfall is going to decrease. So you select models that will tell you that. But actually, if you sampled the full range of the models, you might find that you can't know whether it's going to increase or decrease. You don't actually know the sign of the change. So the models chosen have to, or the model choice has to be done very carefully to take into account independence or a lack thereof, and the particular hazard or type of extreme that you're looking at. And, you know, there I would have serious questions as to whether or not many of the consultancies have the expertise necessary, or you know, whether they can be manipulated in a sense, you know, whether you can make choices that might allow for manipulation. There's also a challenge with the observational record in the sense that these really high impact extremes are events that would not have occurred very often in the past, which means the sample size is very, very small, and or they might only have recently occurred because the climate is changing. Yeah. And the observational record is used to evaluate I don't know if quality is the right word, but the quality of these, I'll just use that for now, of these models. So again, it's hard to use the observational record to evaluate their efficacy in terms of climate extremes. I've already mentioned the dynamical processes. Then there are also compound events, which are not included in these models. And compound events, as I mentioned before, if you had, it's where you have multiple drivers and hazards combining. So I gave the example before, say, of 3 East Coast lows. Often extremes arise as a consequence of a series of different events occurring, not just because of the one event. These models also do not include tipping points, which my understanding is that scientists are becoming increasingly concerned that we might be nearing some tipping points. So these are large scale processes that such as the melting of the Greenland ice sheet. Once they occur, we can't really go back, and we don't really know what the effects will be. So as a consequence of all of that, what you really need to evaluate the decision usefulness of the information that's coming from this is really very, very expert judgment that, again, I would suggest is probably not available to most consultancies and to most businesses, those operating in the accounting domain. So this has implications for the decision usefulness of accounting information and for regulatory compliance. Okay, so if we go to what companies need to do at the entity level. So they need to now produce sustainability or climate reports, and they also need to produce financial reports. So in the climate reports, they need to, and just thinking about the types of information that climate model projections might be used for, they might be used to help generate scenarios, which they are required to do. They might be used, those scenarios might be used as inputs to risk assessments, yeah. And they might also be used in determining or measuring against metrics. So one example is a metric that is in the standards that requires measurement of the area of properties located in the 100-year flood zone. I don't know if any of my science colleagues would have anything to say about that. Yeah, I mean, how realistic is it? Is information available that would allow a business to actually measure that? No, but it's in the standards. Yeah, so it's a problem. businesses are having to do that, but they can't. Now, in terms of the financial report, there's also this idea of connectivity. So information that's here that is financially material should feed into forward-looking estimates. So to determine whether or not the climate might impair an asset in the future or might change, might affect the life of an asset, for example, might shorten the life of an asset, or credit losses, say, I know the banking sector is concerned about this. So these, the information particularly developed from scenarios could be used as inputs over here, which, if we go back and think about all those complexities from the climate projection space, and those climate projections are the only way in which, well, the only source of information about the future climate. There are many other different types of climate models and different sources of climate information, which I'll go into in a moment. Well, yeah, but they are the only way to derive information about the future. And if we think about those challenges, what does that mean for this reporting landscape that businesses are having to comply with? How am I doing for time? I'm actually doing pretty well. Okay, so I suppose the area that I operate in and that I'm interested in exploring is one of radical interdisciplinarity. So that means collaboration across the human and natural sciences. So I know I have colleagues who might collaborate, say, between accounting and taxation, or accounting and finance, and so on. But this is about collaboration really that's quite radical in nature. To develop very, very new ways of doing things. And that means also, I suppose, learning from one another, which is, I hope, what I'm trying to do. So why? Because how else can we legitimately begin to account for the climate system? Yeah. And how else can we be accountable to those communities, people, individual businesses, and so on, who are going to be affected by that system? So, and this is pretty much my last slide. So again, this is in a working paper that we currently have under review. So again, the climate scientists will be very familiar with this concept, storylines. It's an idea that is written about a lot in the climate sciences community. It is, I could imagine, I might be wrong, and I'm happy for my accounting colleagues to correct me on this, but I could imagine that this term story might be viewed as, it immediately infers something that is less accurate in nature. It immediately infers this idea of something that's playful, that's less serious. But it is used in the climate sciences, and it is, there's a section in the latest IPCC report that discusses different types of storylines as a way in which to represent very uncertain information. So what storylines do is they make use of multiple lines of evidence, so including climate projections, but also other forms of evidence, such as flood models, or also very, very often they make use of historical observation as a way to fill in the blanks where those climate projections do not provide the information that we need about future climate extremes that might impact at the local business scale. And so a storyline in itself will be a qualitative narrative, but it may well be informed by information that is quantitative in nature, as well as other information that is qualitative in nature. And the storyline is constructed by experts who use their judgment to come to a view. So the storyline approach is often a product of co-production not only between the sciences and business, but also of people within organisations and people outside of organisations. It's using internal expertise, external expertise. It's using scientific expertise, financial expertise, and many other different types of expertise in between. So it is this type of radical interdisciplinarity and indeed transdisciplinarity because it involves business or organisations and science and academia. It is in contrast to the types of top-down models that are often being provided by some large climate service providers. It is a bottom-up method. And because of that, it can really look at the unique disposition of a company, of an entity. It can look at what are the assets of that company, what are its operations, which industry does it operate in, what is its supply chain vulnerable to, and which particular hazards or climate extremes is it exposed to. Now, that does have implications for comparability because everyone's bottom-up assessment is going to be very, very different to someone else's bottom-up assessment because you're going to use different forms of data, you're exposed to different types of risks, you're going to make use of different experts. So it's always going to be different. You have different assets, different operations, et cetera, et cetera. But what I would suggest is that the process of building a storyline is potentially comparable and is potentially verifiable because of that. If that process can be articulated in a way that can be standardized. Now, storylines, because they draw on multiple lines of evidence, allow the full range of uncertainty to be sampled in a way that climate projections on their own do not. And again, this is really important if we, again, want to think about information that is decision useful in nature, so that we produce information that faithfully represents the phenomenon and that is also allows organisations to make decisions that will not lead them down a pathway of investment that will really damage them in the future. The other thing that they do is they partition different types of uncertainty. So I mentioned earlier on that there's an effect, particularly on climate extremes, from the dynamical processes in the climate system. There's also the thermodynamic processes, and there's much more confidence around thermodynamic processes, whereas dynamic processes, there's far less confidence. So they can be separated out. And again, that really assists in the verification process because it means that you can clearly isolate what can, for example, be measured quantitatively from what cannot be measured quantitatively. And then they also allow for the identification and separation of thresholds of vulnerability. So by that, I mean, for example, the threshold at which, let's say, a transmission tower in Victoria might be smashed to pieces because of extreme winds. So knowing that information in that particular instance is really important because then you can know, well, what is the threshold I build my transmission towers to in the future? And these can then be separated out in a way that the top-down models just don't allow us to do. So these characteristics of storylines which promote, importantly, plausibility. So it's providing a narrative of a plausible unfolding of the future climate in a way that's relevant to a business, but it's not a probability-based assessment. It's not a quantitative assessment. I would argue are more decision useful, verifiable, and comparable than a lot of what we have out there in the marketplace at the moment. And yeah, so that's, I think, it. Yeah.
we have any questions?
Yeah, Tanya, the last bit when you talk about storyline,
Yeah.
that sounds like in a way very similar to some of the stuff in an annual report. So an annual report for most companies, a couple hundred pages, the financials might start about at page 100. And you've got the CEO, the chair of the board, and a whole lot of other people basically giving a story about how it all fits in.
Yeah.
So and now that's not normally, or parts of it may be assured, but other parts are not. And so this could almost be a separate storyline within annual reports.
Yes.
Reports.
Yes, it could be, so it could in effect be a scenario as part of a climate report, sustainability report. But importantly, it might also provide assumptions underpinning inputs to, say, impairment models. So it does feed into, it could feed into quantitative outputs. And I mean, you may disagree, but that's something. So just speaking to practitioners over the last few months, they struggle with that idea because of how wide the uncertainty might be. So one example that I just gave a short while ago is this idea that rainfall might decrease, or it may increase in a particular area. And you know, if you were thinking about replacing stormwater drains on a particular asset, and you were thinking, well, am I going to increase the size of those stormwater drains to cater for future climate or not? And you receive advice that rainfall is going to decrease, then that would affect your decision making in the same way that if you received advice, well, it might increase, but it might also decrease. It would affect your decision making. And the practitioners that I've spoken to, they've found that quite challenging. So the ambiguity around that information they've found quite challenging. They prefer the idea of being given a number with an uncertainty range around it to put into their capital budgeting. Yes, I can't really help them with that in the short term, but that's sort of, yeah, the types of conversations that I've been.
Yeah, I'm not disagreeing with you. I just think what's interesting is people have been grappling for this forever in things like economic factors. So what's the inflation rate? What's the interest rate going to be? They can go either way. And we still have to finally come up with a judgment to go into certain reports. So it's just a more complicated version often of what we've been doing.
Yeah, in some ways there might actually be more useful information here because we're talking about the physical climate system. We're not talking about markets and human behaviour. Yes, the physical climate system responds to human behaviour in the sense that it's responding to the emissions that are put into the atmosphere. But we know that the warming, the inertia in the climate system means that there's certain levels of warming that's going to occur within the next 20 or 30 years that's banked. So there, even though we might have a significant uncertainty around, or the boundary around, say, precipitation in that example, we know enough to know that it's either going to decrease or increase. Whereas with inflation, you might not be able to call it. You might not be able to say, that, sorry.
Yeah, your rainfall example is good because it raises an issue that I was going to ask about anyway, and that is, I guess, what I would be calling impact modeling. All this climate science just gives you variables, which you then have to someone has to translate into how it affects them. And your example is a good one because whether you have to build storm drains doesn't depend on the rainfall that we usually give, which might be the seasonal or monthly mean. It depends how much you can get in an hour. And that's going to go up, even though we don't know what's going to happen to the average. They're two different things completely. But if somebody doesn't realize that, then it's useless information to them. So where does...
And it's also about runoff in the local area as well.
So
it's about
there's a whole bunch of modeling that has to happen. You know, all the climate models that you showed is just step one. And you didn't mention all of the other modeling, so I'm wondering if you
No.
have anything to say about
No,
that.
no, I didn't,
Which
just,
may not even be happening. People may be just grabbing
but again,
values from the climate model.
so this is something, all these other types of modelling you're referring to. So can you mention some of those for us? That for different types of hazards, what sort of models might you rely on?
Well, if you're a farmer, you're worried about agriculture, you need a crop model, right?
Yeah,
Which depends on some characteristics of all these variables that are not obvious.
Yeah.
If you're building storm drains, you need a drainage model. If you're worried about, how tall your dam has to be, you need a hydrologic model for your.
so how is it that someone, even with, I'm suspecting billions of dollars of investment sitting somewhere in New York, can build a model that a company can input its assets into, and they can come back saying, okay, we've determined the vulnerability of your assets. And they claim they can do that for every single business on the planet. How is that feasible?
I don't know.
Yeah.
That's what I'm asking.
Well, surely the answer is insurance. If I'm a director and I know that I can be personally liable for any representation I put into a financial report because I have to sign it off that goes out to investors, the obvious thing I'm going to do is say, I'm going to lay off that risk. And they already do lay off a lot of these risks, whether my power lines fall over or something, I've probably got insurance over some aspects of that, but they'll just push out the insurance envelope, if you like, and say, I'm going to just basically look for a broader range of insurance. I know I can't price it, but here's some bright people from the risk and actuarial team at UNSW, and they're really smart. They know how to work out this. And by the way, there's a pooling effect as well. And so what you may find is that what happens is in this reporting is we know there's climate risks, but we've actually insulated ourselves from them because we've taken out these types of insurance. And actually at a societal level, that might not be a stupid result, because the last thing we want is all 500 companies in the ASX 500 independently doing these sorts of reports and lining the pockets of the consultants.
There is a problem with that, though.
What's that?
And that's if the insurers find themselves in a position where they cannot insure, or if the reinsurers.
Well, that's my point. Is that there'll be a push. There'll be a market response to this, which is, and only certain types of risk will be able to be insured.
I mean,
But I think we can
Tim,
see.
I'm sure you could speak to that.
We'll see an expansion, I think, or some pressure from directors.
Yeah.
Because they personally won't want to be signing off stuff that they don't understand, where they know they don't understand it, because that puts them right in the firing line.
I mean, it's a significant challenge, isn't it?
There's a real adaptivity that needs to be brought into this whole analysis of, okay, that's a bad position to be in as a director. You either resign or you work out some way around it, and most of them try to find some way around it.
Tim, sorry.
Sorry, I've got it on a different topic, so if you want to.
I was just going to add, I think.
Insurability.
Yeah, I mean, if the reinsurers can't cover it, then the insurers can't cover it. And then
My understanding is that there's already some noise that reinsurers are considering.
I think it's a danger.
Yeah.
Yeah, but there's a price for everything. Right. Reinsurers for every century over the last 4 or 5 since Lloyd started have said, we can't insure that. I'll pay you more. Oh, hang on a second. let's run our pencil over that again.
And then I think it all comes down to understanding the uncertainty and being able to represent the uncertainty. So I think what these black box companies are doing is giving one number that they purport to explain the risk, and they're just not including the level of uncertainty that actually exists.
Yeah.
I wanted to get back to the point about the tension between sort of your view of the climate science and these global models and its relationship to reporting and accounting practices. But to me, the way I see you've explained that doesn't seem to be too far removed from, as you say, how we treat global economic measures and how they might be utilised or translated into metrics or reports for an individual organisation. So with measures of GDP, inflation, etc., they're seen as macro variables, and organisations interpret what that means for them one way or the other. And they have to take bets, like you say. There's no certainty around this, and there's going to be no certainty around how organisations should respond to projections of climate change. Although, as you suggest, there's probably a little bit more stickiness around the predictions because there are things baked in, or pardon the pun, into the way in which the climate's going to change. So there's these global measures, they can feed into questions of strategy, of risk, of operations, of supply chain management, and things like that. But then that's a little bit separate from the reporting, where an organisation's trying to account for their contribution to the situation. So, you know, being accountable for their emissions, being accountable for what they do that might affect their local or global environment. So I just want to get a bit more of a sense from you as to what the problem is, because I'm not sure I'm quite seeing. And yes, there could be some factors around how these things start to inform asset impairment and things like that. But again, there are other imponderable things that we've had to take into account when we look at things like valuations of assets. And, you know, if you look at sort of examples like, you know, trying to value a piece of art, but what number do you put on that? Well, people put numbers on them, but there's a significant amount of judgment, and there's, of course, a significant amount of uncertainty around that. So we're dealing with a situation that's radically uncertain. This is not a unique, there are unique aspects to it, but there are other things that organisations and economies take into account that are radically uncertain. So I just want to get a sense a bit more as to what the unique problem is here.
So if you value art, who do you go to do that?
You go to evaluate.
Yeah. And if you want to understand GDP, who do you go to?
Sorry,
If you want to understand GDP, who do you go to?
you're an economist.
Yes. If you want to understand climate science,
You bring in a climate scientist.
yeah. But I suppose the question is, has that been done? And is that being done?
Right.
And are the processes in place to ensure that that happens?
Or is there a scale? That's another question.
That is absolutely one of the questions.
So particularly when you start
Scale
getting,
and bottlenecks.
into mandatory
Absolutely.
reporting, and all organisations are all of a sudden rushing around. Probably the critical issue is, you know, have we got enough scientists to go around?
Everyone here is going to be very much in demand. And yeah, it's going to be offered a lot of money.
Yeah. But so is that
Tim, did you want to say something else about the GDP side of things?
Well, it's related in that I just want to play devil's advocate for this whole agenda for a minute.
Yeah.
You have this big push to value the uncertainty for direct physical risks of climate change. So your asset being flooded or your labor force being inundated with extreme heat, things like that. And that's fine for industries that are very much kind of out there, like agriculture or manufacturing even, or places that have real physical presences. And then you have companies that are just office workers in an office, like the knowledge economy.
Yeah.
And they are going to be much less exposed to direct physical impacts, but much more exposed to macroeconomic impacts of climate change, which are being completely left out.
Yes.
I mean, you could put them under the umbrella of physical risk, but most of the time people talk about direct physical weather, you know, extreme weather events. And so I worry that when you bring in these standards, let's say it's all done well and perfectly, the companies that are highly exposed have high physical risk to climate change. And there are going to be companies that have low physical risk to climate change. Then you have companies overseas doing the same thing that have no regulatory framework whatsoever. And for this to make a real difference in the world, they have to be giving information, as you said, that's decision useful, right? And what is decision useful in this case? The optimistic scenario is that it will cause investors and creditors to move towards companies that are hardening their processes towards the physical risk of climate change and taking it a lot more seriously. But what could happen instead is that instead it moves investment away from people, away from industries that have direct physical exposure, towards companies that are much more exposed to macro risk that is not being considered whatsoever, or movement away from Australia entirely, or countries that have this mechanism, towards developing countries which have no framework whatsoever and are likely even more exposed to the direct physical risk of climate change. And then the more successful this kind of drive is, the more vulnerable our country's economy could be in 40 years, because we've moved even more manufacturing in. So obviously some things have to be done here, not only here, but there are other things that can be offshored. And so I don't know, I see this as very much could be a double-edged sword, unless it's done globally in a very consistent way.
I push back on the global consistency bit, because there's a tension here that let's pretend that there is some perfect model out there that we're all striving towards, and assume that exists. That would be great, because then we could all use it. But the problem is we know that it doesn't. And so the risk that you then have as a global society is that you all eschew some correlated, some model that has correlated risks, or some set of models that have correlated risks. And so actually there's a virtue in the fact that we actually have a decentralized process where lots of people are developing different models, which may not be the same, because they can't all be right, but maybe they won't all be wrong either, or they might be wrong in different ways. One of the concerns I've had with some of the more doctrinaire approaches to what we're talking about here is, we should all do it exactly the same way. Is fine, but then what about the things that doesn't capture? We're all exposed to it. We won't know we won't even realize it's there. It's the old Maginot line that the French built to stop the Germans from coming in, and the Germans just drove around it. So I think one of the things that we need to debate and discuss in this sort of environment is, okay, so system design here, people who do regulation know about that kind of stuff, but others don't. And then technicalities around some of the science people don't know about. And I think that's the value of these debates, because I don't think heading towards a single model where it's all very similar is actually, particularly in that process where we're still trying to work out what's really going on, is actually optimal, because we all end up looking at the same thing, and the next risk will be one we haven't even thought of or haven't modeled yet.
It also leads to the types of risks that you were talking about, Tim.
Yeah, exactly. That's exactly.
Capital might completely, be evacuated from a region that actually really needs investment. So you're absolutely right on those problems. So yeah, I don't have an answer for that, Tim.
The other issue is we've got decision relevant. There's a big difference between primary and secondary markets here. So if I'm lending to someone, I care about the entity and the risks it runs. If I'm choosing whether to buy the debt on the market of a particular entity or the shares of an entity, now I'm interested in the marginal position and a relativity between them and other people. And so the types of information I need are actually slightly different. And so there's a danger that we don't recognize the use that the information.
I'll listen for when they're going to stop.
Yes.
It's got a commentary.
I probably can.
I don't know where that's coming from.
You told us there was nobody listening. Somebody told us.
No, I think that's
I think it's
Alison in her office who's actually running the Zoom.
Yeah, she maybe didn't mute it. Might need to let her know. But I mean, going back to your point about these potential macroeconomic processes that might be triggered. I mean, that's something that can also be captured in storylines, because my understanding is that they're not currently incorporated in integrated assessment models.
I just don't know how you would plausibly talk about global macroeconomic risk from a bottom-up, case-by-case storyline, case study kind of thing. I don't.
There are a couple of examples around where that has been done.
How would you, like, without a global top-down model that's good, which might not exist yet, but I don't know how you would do that.
Well,
I'm sure you can have your cake and eat it too, and have this bottom-up bespoke, here's my expert assessment.
you can make assumptions about what might occur globally, say over the next 5 to 10 years, based on your knowledge of current.
But if your knowledge is your knowledge could only be based entirely off of global top-down modeling, quantitative modeling of some kind. So therein, the storyline is based on the modeling anyway, just indirectly.
Oh, but the storyline approach does use many different types of models. So it's informed by many different sources of data.
And you put your assessment on what's relevant, what's not relevant,
That's where the expert judgment comes in.
I just wonder what the way forward is here, because the storyline idea that you're talking about is not the pathway that anyone's taking at the moment in terms of regulation and reporting.
No, they're beginning to talk about it though.
So I suppose that may lead us down a pathway of, what we've got in financial reporting about non-GAAP earnings, and everyone come out with alternate measures that often have more relevance than the actual reported earnings. But I wonder whether there's a middle ground here in the short to medium term to sort of say, well, this is the pathway we're going down in terms of risk assessment and scenario analysis and so forth. That overlaid on top of that might be some storylines or some narratives rather than A or B. There's a combination.
That's what we propose in this paper.
Explore.
That's what we propose in this paper, that it actually, if you look at the different, if you look, say, at the risk assessment standards, storyline approach actually fits in. It can be, adapted to those standards. It can also be, it is in effect already, if you look at some of the, what you might refer to as, say, the gold standard scenarios in the marketplace, they are storylines. So it is occurring, it's just not really named, and people aren't really aware of it. So the Network for Green the Financial System, which is, they've published scenarios for central banks and financial regulators, and they've been used for stress testing. So APRA, for example, have used the NGFS scenarios. They themselves are also aware of, I suppose, some of the limitations that they've had with respect to their scenarios, and are aware that, maybe we need to start looking at shorter term scenarios rather than, say, 30 to 50 year scenarios. So there's stuff happening. And I know that there are larger financial institutions in Europe that are beginning to make some noise around storylines as well. I don't yet know why storylines couldn't be incorporated as a method that satisfies the needs of scenario analysis, risk assessment, and inputs to forward-looking financial estimates. Haven't yet.
Might be a way forward,
Yeah.
rather than saying this is the pathway going, here's an alternate pathway.
Yeah.
Collectively, there's some synergy here.
Yeah. It's not actually an alternative. It's more just let's think about doing what we have slightly differently.
Okay, great. I was interested in this idea of decision usefulness. So from a psychology background, it sounds like an empirical question. How do you evaluate the decision usefulness? Is that something?
Suppose you go back and look at the expert judgments, which are probably the people using the reports. So it could be investors, could be creditors.
So they have expert judgment?
Well, like everything else, there'll be degrees of expertise, but it'll be no different to a doctor or something like that. They'll have training, they'll have expertise in, and so you'll be probably looking at their judgments and how they're influenced by various factors that would happen. So basically the JDM literature, which Ben's obviously an expert in, it fits in nicely with all that.
You also have more than one expert looking at it, so it is different from a doctor. I mean, that's one of the issues around the financial stuff is can behave as if it was a single expert, but it's actually the equilibrium of a whole range of different people, different views and different ways of thinking about financial issues, looking at it that determines the price. So you only get one price, but you might have 10 different people who, and the resolution of all their supply and demand is that. So you don't need to have a single. The other thing is, this might be the one example where the tail wagging the dog is a good thing. So what we really want is for businesses to do things differently, to be more attentive to the environmental and climate impact they have. It may well be that we don't need them actually to generate perfect numbers that are correct to 4 decimal places. But by forcing them to think about what they're going to put it, they'll actually think about what they're actually doing. And not just how to measure it, but actually what they're physically doing, what their business, what sorts of issues are arising in their supply chain and their product set and so on. And actually, storylines, I think, plays into that really well, because it tells us people understand stories, and managers will understand stories much better.
It's much also as a communication tool. They're much more interesting. I mean, psychology people here will sure attest to that. Rather than facts, which anyway, I'm not going to talk about an area that I don't know about, but my understanding, is that facts we can be quite distant to them, whereas a narrative we might be able to relate to much more at a personal level. Please correct me if I'm wrong. So
Thank you, everyone. I'm sure if you have any other questions or thoughts or observations, I'm sure we all do. Please send them through to Tanya, to all team members. Thank you very much for coming along. Hope you'll be able to join us for future events like this, and tell your colleagues as well how much fun you had, how good the morning tea was, all those things. Yeah, go forth and enjoy the rest of the day.